I'm John Lewis, and you're listening to 360 Degree City, a podcast where we talk to all kinds of folks that are making life in cities better. Our hope is that at the end of each episode, you'll start to see your own city from a slightly different angle. Back in the spring, we released an episode called Let's Get Walking. In that episode, I went on walks with two great guests. With Chuck McCarthy, also known as the People Walker, we sauntered through Los Angeles.
Walking is great exercise, and most people, if they go to the doctor and they're overweight, the doctor doesn't say, oh, go run a marathon tomorrow or start taking cardio, funk, cross tech fitness. They're going to say you need to start walking.
In the second walk, Jill Robertson showed me around the new funicular project that connects to Edmonton's river valley.
We can, smell things. I feel the wind on my face, the sun on my back. You don't get that experience in a car. And so I feel much more connected to the city in this scale. And I think that people do. And that was what the intention was behind Jane's Walk, is helping people be connected to the city in a different way or in a different experience.
Walking has many benefits for our physical, mental, and social health. Studies show that walking can help improve physical health in many ways and help us think more clearly. You've probably heard before that walking can help reduce the risk of breast cancer, obesity, and diabetes. It can also help moderate our mood, help us think more clearly, and make us more creative. But there's also other somewhat obscure health benefits as well. For example, two studies from the University of Exeter found that a 15-minute walk can curb cravings for chocolate and even reduce the amount of chocolate you eat in stressful situations. So if you can't control your chocolate consumption, perhaps lace up those shoes and get outside. Beyond physical health benefits, walking is also a great way to get to know people. As Mark Twain once said, the true charm of pedestrianism does not lie in the walking or in the scenery, but in the talking. But many streets are built for cars instead of people, which generally makes walking much less pleasant. After a long stretch of neglect, designing streets to allow people to enjoy walking has become an increasingly important urban design consideration. There are many theories about what makes a street walkable. As Jeff Speck, the Walkable Cities guru, says,
if people are to walk, the walk has to be as good as a drive. Pretty straightforward. And you could say the same thing about biking. The walk or the bike has to be as good as the drive. And in order to do so, it has to do four things simultaneously. It has to be useful, it has to be safe, it has to be comfortable, and it has to be interesting.
In this episode, we're going to dive deeper into Jeff Speck's general theory of walkability.
Hi, my name is Jeff Speck, and I'm a city planner based in Boston.
Jeff's general theory of walkability was published in 2012 in his book, Walkable City: How Downtown Can Save America One Step at a Time. The book consolidated ideas and theories from many other urban thinkers and designers into a clear and hopeful case for change in our cities. I've heard it referenced by a variety of professional city builders, as well as my father-in-law, who's a 70-year-old retired physician. So I think it's safe to say that the ideas in the book resonate with all kinds of readers.
The general theory of walkability, it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek statement, but it is a theory, which means it's a hypothesis that's continually being tested and modified, and we're still tweaking it around the edges as we go. But it says that in America, and I would say in North America and lots of other places in the world, where driving is so easy and so cheap, and you're paying a mere fraction of the true cost of driving because it's subsidized in so many different ways. And the car is sitting there in the driveway between you and everything else. And interestingly, and I talk about this in Walkable City, it turns out that if you own a standard sedan, 4/5 of the cost of driving are fixed costs and only 1/5 are variable costs. So there's every incentive to drive it all the time because every mile costs less than the mile before. So under those circumstances, how do you get people to walk? And the answer is that if people are to walk, the walk has to be as good as a drive. Pretty straightforward. And you could say the same thing about biking. The walk or the bike has to be as good as the drive. And in order to do so, it has to do four things simultaneously. It has to be useful, it has to be safe, it has to be comfortable, and it has to be interesting. So each one of those is kind of a chunk of the book, Walkable City. It's a chunk of the walkability studies that I do for cities. And, the question is, we're looking at a downtown area, for example. What can you do to achieve all four of those things at once? To make walking useful, to make it safe, to make it comfortable, and to make it interesting. The useful walk has to do mostly with mixed use, having things that are different than what you're currently in, close at hand. And of course, that's something that zoning mitigated against for many, many years. And not just the collection of different uses in your downtown, but the ratios at which they exist are essential in making them as great as they can be. And the best downtowns have a really great balance of workplace and housing. And Jane Jacobs talked about this when she was describing Wall Street around 1960, and it was a different place in 1960. And she said, why does Wall Street have not one great restaurant, not one great gym? And the answer is that a great restaurant or a great gym needs both lunchtime and dinner time crowd, needs both. So when you get in most downtowns, of course, the ratio is off and the housing is what's low, especially in America. Most downtowns have a tremendous dearth of housing. When the housing comes back, that's when everything else starts to kick in, because you're getting the daytime activity and the nighttime activity. So not only does the street life, 24/7 kick in, but the amenities start to get really great. So the useful walk is mixing uses properly, and then into that same category falls transit, because transit makes walking much more useful. So you can have a useful walk just on foot for a whole neighborhood, but a whole city can have a useful walk if there's transit to get you from walkable place to walkable place. So connecting the walkable nodes together with transit is the other part of that equation. The second category, the safe walk, is where I spend most of my time, because the easiest thing to fix in cities is the streets. And it's also the thing that the cities control. So typically you go to a city and you want to make the walk more useful. Well, that has to do mostly with what private buildings are in the area that you're looking at. You want to make it more comfortable and more interesting. Also, it's what are the buildings that are lining the streets mostly. The streets themselves are under the city's control. They're public. The city has the opportunity to fix them very quickly with construction or just with paint, and we'll talk about that. And so most places I go, since the goal now is to see marked improvement within 2 or 3 years, not 20 years like the typical planning window, we focus very much on the redesign of streets. And in this category of safe streets, there's about 10 different subcategories that you can investigate. How many lanes are there? Are there too many lanes? Are there more lanes than you need? How wide are the lanes? Are they wider than they should be? Because wider lanes encourages speeding. Are there bike facilities? Because A, you want to welcome cyclists, and B, having bikes in the roadway makes the roadway safer for everyone. The statistics make that very clear. D, what am I on? Is there parallel parking protecting the curbs? Because there's no match for parallel parking when it comes to having a barrier of steel between the roadway and the sidewalks to make the sidewalks feel safe. And it's almost impossible to have sidewalk dining without parallel parking. Are there trees, which contribute also, especially as they grow, to making the curbs feel safe? And they also contribute a ton to urban comfort, but that's the next category, so we can get to that later. And so there's like 5 other things I didn't even mention, but all of those add up to streets being safer for cars traveling the speed limit instead of well above the speed limit. And the challenge in cities is to change those things very quickly. It's a budgetary challenge and it's a political challenge. The budgetary challenge is there's only so much money, and that's why I generally advocate making changes with paint and not with construction. Do you build it or do you paint it? And in a lot of cities that I'm working in, we look for the quick wins with just a new top coat of asphalt and new striping rather than spending a lot of money on construction. And then the second impediment, political, typically has to do with the fact that the Public Works Department has been doing it wrong for so many years, and there are people there who can't do it differently without admitting they were wrong. And so often you need a top-down direction, unless you're in one of those cities that has a real forward thinking, and there are more and more now, but unless you're in one of those cities that has a progressive traffic engineer on staff, then you need the mayor and city council essentially to direct the Public Works Department to do what Jeff says, right? And it's I'm a stand-in for dozens of people who are doing this work. The comfortable walk is a little bit counterintuitive because we all love to climb mountains and see wide open spaces. That's an American thing. But as I describe in the book, the evolutionary biologists tell us that all animals are simultaneously seeking prospect and refuge. Prospect means you can see your predators from a distance, and refuge means that you feel that your flanks are covered from attack. And if you don't feel that your flanks are covered, you don't feel comfortable in a space. And so what's the ratio of the height of the street wall to the width of the street? We say a plaza is only as good as its edges, a street is only as good as its walls. And as designers, it's our obligation to create what we call outdoor living rooms. A room is not a room without that sensitive boundary and enclosure. So you can think about European cities and spaces and squares where it's actually even hard to see out. Like if you're in a good European square, the way the corners are handled, you may not even be able to find a way for your eyes to escape that space. Whereas the typical American street, has a setback low building on one side and a parking lot on the other, and you have that absolute lack of spatial containment that gives you a sense of comfort. So bringing those missing teeth back, bringing the missing noses back on corners, that's essential to the work that we do, and an often forgotten part of what we do. And then finally, and this is the sort of thing that, for example, Jan Gehl in Cities for People talks about so well, the interesting walk. The edges of the street have to be sticky. They have to be interesting. They can't be just dull and boring, exposed parking structures or blank walls. And I think Jan Gehl talks about thick facades. And Christopher Alexander used to talk about the different stages of publicness and privateness. And that's why things like front porches are so important, or awnings. So what can you do besides just having a building there to make the space interesting? And in most North American cities, typically the great villain that you need to somehow mask or deal with is the structured parking deck, which sits right up against the sidewalk edge. And there have been many nice examples of placing housing between the street and those decks, just a 25-foot thick crust of housing that completely hides the parking deck, or doing a good job, because many cities have done a bad job, of creating a first floor of retail in that parking deck, where you have to have a higher ceiling, you have to do other things to make it really work, which some cities forgot. But that's a big contributor to the interest of walking.
These four aspects of walkability, useful, safe, comfortable, and interesting, are definitely interconnected.
In a good walkable place, they are interconnected. But what you find in many cities, is that they're independent, and that makes it kind of easy to fix. So I guess the interesting walk and the comfortable walk often go together, because they both require edges. But what you often find in cities are places where the walk is theoretically comfortable and interesting, but it's been destroyed by a super fast road. And that's the condition that's easiest to fix, and that's why you have to pick your winners. So there's an approach that Andres Duany calls urban triage. I don't call it that anymore because it scares people, and probably it should. But understanding that if your goal is to create walkability, the general theory of walkability tells us that you really won't do much good by only providing part of the puzzle. Therefore, you should find those places where you can provide the whole puzzle, the whole enchilada, and start there. And the goal, I would say that the strategy is to find a place that you can make excellent, truly excellent, and then work concentrically from it. But don't do what so many cities do, which is these mayors, they feel an obligation to the whole city kind of equally, and then they take their walkability fairy dust and they sprinkle it kind of lightly everywhere, and you end up with a beautiful set of benches and trash cans on the road between the mall and the office park where no one's walking, right? So you identify the places, and this is actually something I do in every walkability study, is you identify the places where walking is useful, comfortable, and interesting, but not safe, right? Where there's useful mixed-use buildings that hold the edge of the space and have good fronts, And that's where you direct the first investments in roadway improvement, because that's where you can have the whole enchilada.
And so that's interesting. And one of your points that you make in Walkable City is where can you spend the least amount of money to make the most difference? I think that's a really important thing, because just the scale of investment in cities can be daunting even for folks that work in the business. So can you maybe give us a story about a place that has taken that approach of understanding that it doesn't take a ton of money all the time to make a big difference, and what they did?
My experience, kind of on the extreme end, was working in Cedar Rapids, where they realized they had walkability issues downtown. They were about to reconstruct one street for about 5 blocks, and the price tag was about $3 million. And I said, why spend that $3 million on this one street when you could spend the same amount of money and restripe your whole downtown grid, which is about 25 blocks, about a 5x5 grid. And so we put the reconstruction on hold, and we together redesigned all 25 blocks of streets. And we added about 60% more parking, because there were just too many lanes that they didn't need. We more than doubled the bike infrastructure. And then they decided to not spend any money on it at all. Roughly, I'm kind of fudging the story, but what they said was, we have an operating budget in our public works department where these streets come up for repaving and restriping anyway on a regular basis. So over the next 5-6 years, when a street comes up for repaving, we're just going to stripe it to the new standard. And what happened in Cedar Rapids is, it's probably only half done now. But whenever they restripe a street, they restripe it to the new standard, and slowly they're working their way to a much more walkable downtown, spending effectively nothing, because it's money that would have been spent anyway.
Right. Terrific. So one of the things I'm always interested in is how decisions are often reflections of the values we hold, whether individually or collectively. And I think you've done a really great job in your work of highlighting how so many cities around the world have obviously been built around the needs of the automobile. And those are results of countless decisions, big and small, all over the place. What kind of values do you think those decisions over previous decades have reflected? And the shift that you're speaking about, what kind of values are those different values that are emerging as a result of these actions and decisions?
I would say that people still underestimate the degree to which the car culture was a function not just of an ethos of a country which was driven economically, no pun intended, by car manufacturing, but also they reflect incredible subsidies and other programs that made suburbanization absolutely inevitable. And I'm talking not just about the federal highway program, but about the federal home loan programs, which you effectively could only use for new construction. You couldn't use to renovate existing places, and effectively were only used for new developments like Levittown, and couldn't be used for existing neighborhoods. We need programs, top down, I hate to say it, but we need programs that both encourage and allow higher density around transit, and also that subsidize the developer construction of attainable housing that has to stay attainable within short distances of transit stations and in our downtowns, because that's what's going to really make our society successful.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And the idea of downtowns being almost victims of their own success, and your idea of picking winners, in that context, that speaks really to looking for those other parts of the city that have those bones and making sure that they're accessible to folks.
Yeah, I mean I was working in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which is a lovely little downtown, and it's come a long way in the last 20 years from essentially not pleasant to a tourist attraction. And they're still overrun a little bit by a one-way pair that goes right through the downtown. And I was presenting to them, and I did what I always did, which is what I showed them how they could convert the one-way pair to two-way travel And inevitably, the place would get better. The rents would go higher. The merchants would become better. And then I said, but should you do this? And this is probably the first time I'd ever said this. I said, do you want to be better? Maybe you shouldn't be better. The Banana Republic just opened in your downtown. Do you want more Banana Republics, or do you want more, Joe's Apparel? You're losing your individual character because your rents are going up because you're so good already. And in fact, here's a place maybe where a one-way to two-way reversion does not make sense, because you will end up with one more seen it all before chain store downtown. And I think you articulated it very well, which is, let's find the places that still need a boost and spend the money there.
Okay, so the last question that we ask everybody that comes onto the podcast, and I'll have to give you a warning that people find this difficult and painful. Can you give one city that you love and why, knowing that you love a lot of cities?
The best city in the world has to be Venice.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it's got no cars, and I love cars. I've been a car nut since I was a little kid. I had subscriptions to Road and Track and Car and Driver, and I still someday will own a Ferrari. God damn it! But walking around a city, which, and I should say, it's a tremendous impediment to people who are rolling. So the caveat that it's not good for handicap, and that's a function of obviously its age and condition. But with that caveat, is a place that I like to go. Well, my knees are working, and usually they are. It's just unlike any other place in the world, and it is principally so walkable as a function of the absence of cars and trucks. Mm-hmm.
Terrific. My walking out of the train station in Venice is one of the moments that is very imprinted on my brain very strongly. I recall walking out and seeing the Grand Canal, and just you've seen it 100 different ways, magazines and movies, and this place really exists. And then as I walked through the city, one of the things that really stood out for me was how deafeningly quiet it was. And it took me about a day and a half before I could really process it. And then I thought, oh, well, it's the absence of cars. I appreciate the walkability strategies that Jeff discussed. The concept of picking winners and investing in places with the most potential can be challenging when areas of a city are competing for limited resources. But it also focuses on the areas of biggest impact, which can ultimately create greater benefit. I love the strategy to use paint and other affordable methods to reshape a street before investing millions of dollars, a tactical approach to urbanism that we discussed with previous guest Mike Lydon. Jeff also briefly raised the dilemma about how improved street design can lead to a more attractive and valued area, which potentially makes a place less affordable. This is a challenge that many city builders are grappling with today. How do we improve neighborhood design while still maintaining affordability so that existing residents aren't displaced? There isn't enough time to fully grapple with that question today, but we'll talk about it in a future episode. Jeff just released a new book called Walkable City Rules: 101 Steps to Making Better Places. Some of his rules include: number 3, when advocating for walkability, use climate change arguments and stress location efficiency. Rule 31, to make streets safer, focus on speeding. And Rule 100, don't give up on sprawl. Instead, make suburban streets safer and more walkable too. To learn about 98 more rules and instructions, check out his new book. 360 Degree City is created by the team at Intelligent Futures. To learn more about the work we do, you can go to intelligentfutures.ca. If you like the podcast, please share it with someone that might be interested in seeing their own city from a different angle. I'm John Lewis. Thanks for stopping by.